What if your trauma response was never a weakness, but a finely tuned survival mechanism wired for evolution? In this groundbreaking episode, world renowned neurosexuality educator Nishita Rao joins us to decode the brain and the body's response to sexual trauma and why understanding it can be the most radical act of self compassion. Welcome to Happiness on Tap, where we bring you inspiring stories and practical insights for a happier, more fulfilling life. Your go to podcast for uplifting conversations that stir the heart and ignite the spirit. I'm your host, Leann, and today's guest is the extraordinary Nishita, a powerhouse in sex education, neuroscience, and cross cultural healing. As the first and only Indian AASECT certified sex educator and interdisciplinary researcher with roots in behavioral neuroendocrinology and sexual trauma recovery, Nishita brings the worlds of science, sexology, and spirituality in a way that is deeply healing and unapologetically bold. Nishita leads multiple global initiatives from the Sex Scholars Library to the Soul Sync Sanctuary, pioneering trauma-informed and culturally responsive approaches to sexual wellness. In today's conversation, we explore the neurobiology of sexual trauma, answering the hard questions so many survivors have been too afraid or too ashamed to ask. You'll walk away with a deeper understanding of how your brain and body are not broken, but responding exactly as they were built to do in the face of trauma. Let's welcome Nishita to the show. Nishita, it is such an honor to have you join us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Leann. It's an honor to be here as well.
I'm so looking forward to this conversation because, as I stated, these questions are the tough questions. They're questions that trauma survivors are just afraid to ask, or they've lived in shame. So I would really love, for you to help everyone understand that it's not them. They didn't do anything wrong. It's not their fault. And that their body is doing exactly what it is meant to do to protect them and keep them safe. So we'll get started right away. Why don't people run away or scream when they are being assaulted? Why does the brain prioritize in moments of danger, and how does it override what we should do?
Well, we are going in big guns, I guess. Well, before I delve further into why we do certain uh, actionary behaviors and why we don't, is first understand how the brain sort of functions. We are under the assumption that the brain has been in a reactionary mode quite often. Something happens, we respond uh, with something internal or an external behavior that we do see outside. But many a times, based on the research that is done, we know that the brain is not reactionary, it is anticipatory. So the brain has ever since developed any possible cognitive thought, is able to uh, layer on and stimulate some sort of awareness as to what could and could not happen in that lifespan. That being said, it runs several simulations in your mind to predict things that are going to possibly happen. And based upon that, has certain bypass mechanisms that exist just in case an individual does find themselves in such a precarious moment. When we are in a life-threatening situation, it's just a fraction of a second that the brain decides to function in a particular manner in order to ensure that the body survives. Um, Now, that can be dependent on, well, how the individual has lived, what are the behaviors that come habitually to an individual, what they're classified as extreme survival reflexes in some individuals. And the brain prioritizes such behaviors. Why? Because they know that energy expenditure over here is going to be very, very less. Which, by that, I know it's a big words and stuff like that, to lower it down and to probably have a much deeper understanding, what we call as the rational part of our mind, prefrontal cortex. And it's a highly layered, structured area wherein we have got too many synapses put in place. To run this space, you need a lot more of oxygen. You need a lot more of ATP, that is what we call as energy. To run the PFC, you also require time. And we do not have time when it comes to life-threatening situations. In a fraction of a second, an individual has to possibly react in a way that could be beneficial for them. In such scenarios, the brain resorts to the limbic system, aka the amygdala and the rest of the areas, to ensure that energy is being conserved only for reactions that demand less amount of energy. To fight, to flee requires a lot more energy. You often freeze, you often fawn. Why? Because it saves energy, first of all. Secondly, it gives you time to even understand the various methodologies by which the perpetrator might be acting upon you, thus giving you some more additional time to possibly formulate another response, or even it can even help in your well, memory formation to ensure such a thing doesn't happen again.
Thank you so much for starting us there. That is such valuable information for those of us that don't have, extensive knowledge of our brain and why it does what it does, and what parts of the brain are reacting in certain ways, like you said, to conserve energy or to be able to react quickly. I think we just live in this automatic system where everything is so fast, and we're used to operating super fast. But when we're in those kinds of situations, our body is responding, like you said, in a way that it's been trained to respond, where it's pulling from memories, where it's pulling from available resources. So I really appreciate you kind of starting us there and walking us through, the difference between anticipatory and reactionary responses in the body.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we often think of it, we live in a victim blaming society. We often think that the whole onus is upon us as to why we are acting the way we act. And we should probably change that script. It's high time that we do so.
I agree. There isn't enough information being put out there. So again, I thank you for coming on the podcast and explaining this information to help not only the victim, but everyone else in the world understand and become more knowledgeable about what our body is doing, instead of showing up and passing blame or judgment. There's such horrible cultural judgments out there.
Indeed.
And so I really want to thank you for your time today, for coming and helping clarify some of this information. Can you walk us through, and you did a little bit, the survival responses beyond fight or flight, and how they've shaped our past experiences?
Hmm. Um, well, we aren't the only species to probably have survival responses. Reflexes like freezing, for dissociation, immobility, these are reflexes in the animal kingdom, and it is not just upon humans that responses such as this do occur. Um, that being said, I have noticed a higher degree of uh, behaviors catering to fawning and freeze responses if an individual has been brought up in an uneasy environment. That is possibly uh, something that it becomes difficult to sort of predict how parental figures may or may not respond to a level wherein behaviors are being prioritized to ensure that the environment is safe enough, first of all, to exist, and then followed by any possible reactionary mechanisms to ensure we are safe enough. That being said, when we talk about freezing and fawning, and well, I it's a neat category to kind of put everything together. But what I like to call it is the habitual responses and extreme survival reflexes. Habitual responses, in the sense, if you are brought up in an authoritative environment, raised volumes, raised voices are an often case on an everyday life. Individuals may or may not respond by just crying or just bursting into tears with no possible explanation. If just an individual comes in and starts raising the volume at them, why do we do that? There's a lot of research that to that in detail. These are habitual responses. Responses as in, if someone comes over to you and gropes you in public and you respond with, "I'm sorry, I was in your way." That is a habitual response because you are phoning to the individual by saying, "Okay, I hope you're going to be, you know, I would say safe enough for me in a way that you're not going to react to anything that I say." So you establish that and then proceed to probably take care of yourself. Sometimes this goes on. Sometimes you cater to the well being of the individual. Sometimes you are, well, cuddling with your perpetrator just to ensure that they fall asleep and they're no longer angry, to a level wherein once they do, that's when you flee. That's when you actually run away. Um, Extreme survival reflexes look a little bit different. Alongside dissociation, we have tonic immobility, we have collapsed immobility. Uh, these are stages wherein individuals say that uh, they feel paralyzed, that they cannot move, um, that the option, and they're often, well, sometimes they're coming in and out of consciousness. Situations like these are built in our system to sort of ensure that we stay safe. It's also, I believe, built in to ensure that the degree of PTSD an individual can experience thereafter can also be reduced.
Huh. Thank you for breaking those both down. Um, I think fawning is one that I would say I don't have as much uh, information about. So having you share that information actually made me think of my own reactions to the abusive household that I grew up in, and seeing as an adult how one of my first responses is to apologize for whatever it may be. You know, if I forgot to fill the water pitcher, if I forgot to do something else, like my first reaction is to apologize. And having a partner that recognized that behavior has, been vital for me to have somebody reassure me that I don't need to constantly say, I am sorry. I lead with, I am sorry.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
But being able to share with him the abuse that I grew up in, that was just second nature for me to apologize, to try to de-escalate any situation.
Yeah. And it has worked for you. So that's one of the major reasons. Like the brain is not going to respond with the behavior unless and until it is sure that at least 50% of the time it has worked. So you prioritize certain situations in order to ensure that, well, if it has had a history of working for me, why not continue with it? And after a while, it just becomes a habit. It becomes, well, you're doing it subconsciously. You're not really doing it consciously anymore.
Absolutely. Yeah. I would definitely say that for myself in all situations, not just with my partner, but in work situations. Um, like you said, anytime there's a raised voice, or anytime, maybe an employer was dissatisfied with something that I did, it's just this reaction, just a normal reaction for me that I automatically lead with and don't even honestly, like I said, realize that I'm doing it. As opposed, I think, over having a husband who really is working with me on a lot of the habits that I developed growing up in an abusive household. Developing a voice and being able to speak up for myself and not starting the conversation with "I'm sorry" has been
Mhm.
um, a huge shift in my life, but it has
Yeah.
been such an empowerment thing that I catch myself now that I'm really not apologizing for things like I used to.
Yeah, I mean, it involves a lot of unlearning and relearning how to exist in any sort of a relationship that is stable, that is predictable, and not hazy, not unpredictable and scary. And uh, it will take a lot of time, yes, for the brain to readjust, but the brain does. And I would say it is extremely good in adjusting to newer situations and newer scenarios in life, considering that it has to adapt and evolve in order for you to survive. So, kudos to the fact that the brain is actually adjusting and moving from a space of uneasiness to a space of existing without having to second guess and without having to constantly apologize. And uh, yeah, it's really really nice to hear that you're actually healing from within.
Yeah, and knowing that I have this kind of mind body connection, that my mind is acknowledging that my body is feeling safe, because I
Mhm.
never had that safety growing up. I don't think I've had safety from birth to less than 10 years ago,
Yeah,
where I
yeah.
truly felt safe in my environment, safe in myself. Um, so it has been beautiful, I guess, to feel that safety, to acknowledge that safety, and to know that everything else is catching up along the way, between my
Yeah.
mind and my body.
Yeah.
Let's talk some more about the wonderful brain and all it does. Why are memories often unclear, distorted, or confusing after trauma?
Hmm. The central key point to any sort of long-term memory formation is how much of oxygen is available after the brain has probably reacted uh, to the extreme scenarios that are present in front of you. Uh, Having gauged how much of oxygen is available, the brain sort of moves into, okay, what are the things that we consider as central details to the trauma? what are the things that we consider as peripheral details to memory formation. And this just happens naturally, and it's not really associated only with trauma. What is different within trauma is that we get very less of the central details. And by that, I mean things like how long did a traumatic event last? Or things on the lines of, okay, what was the person wearing? How did the assailant look like? Where did the assailant come from? These are things that when you hear people within a forensic environment, you rarely get a coherent map of who this individual is. And quite often, people, specifically within the investigation stages, they just disregard the victims' opinions, not just opinions, memories of what just happened, considering that the whole justice system is based out of who was the person? Did you actually see this person or not? Did this person come from here or not? And those are things that rarely get coded. What gets coded are peripheral stuff. For example, if someone is being assaulted upon, one may feel the need to dissociate from the scenario, focus on something that is not the person, but is peripheral in the environment. Maybe there's a vase with few flowers in the corner, and one is just focusing on the vase. This dissociation sort of helps to ensure that you're not coding the painful aspects of the memory, which may or may not cause any PTSD reactions in the future. So you don't really have the actual central details that is required, and that forensic departments sort of focus on in the investigation. What you may have is, well, what kind of cologne was the individual wearing? Uh, Situations along the lines of what's there in the environment around you, so as to get a better grasp of where you are in case you have enough energy, and if you want to respond in a fleeing reaction, what pathway are you going to take in order to actually flee? And all these things are, well, may or may not happen, but the brain is actually taking into accounts of several things that are going on. uh, what we also have is fragmented memories, and this is very, very common amongst situations wherein dissociation occurs and there's collapsed immobility. By that, I mean an individual comes in and out of consciousness constantly. It's kind of like you check in and you see, oh, it's still going on. Okay, I'm out. Oh, it's still going on. Okay, I'm out. So you're trying to ensure that it's too painful for me to actually be present in the moment to actually see what's going on, that the brain goes into shock again and goes out of consciousness again. So you get fragmented memories of what's going on. Time sequence information, well, it's rarely present. But you get more contextual information, like, layout of the room, as opposed to how orderly did the attacks occur. What we kind of see is things get jumbled up. By that I mean, one moment an individual is talking about someone approaching them, another moment they're talking about how they are leaving after the assault has occurred. So it doesn't follow the sequential route of how memory is being consolidated in the brain, like A, then B, then C, then D. It just may go from A to D to B to C, and that's how the information is presented to you. Again, this is a clear and a classic symptom of something that is traumatic occurring in that moment. That one is trying to clock down memories that are important, first of all, that may or may not occur in the future. So, if such a situation occurs, the brain can immediately react at a much faster rate than it did so in the previous time. Um, so we get a lot of, fragmented memories because of that. So when we do see a non trauma-oriented explicit memory formation, you're talking about encoding, then consolidating, then the memory goes into stored memory as episodic memory. With the prefrontal cortex that is already being impaired, there's not much of activity going on there. You get islands of memory or fragmented memories that get encoded. And hence, once it does get consolidated and stored, well, we already know the time sequence and information is either absent or maybe present, but to a degree it might be present. So when it does get consolidated and stored, it just presents itself based on how the body or the mind characterizes what is important information to be noted, such that the body can survive in the future, as opposed to how law enforcement or how forensic analysis sort of works in order to ensure that we have a sequential manner in which we can track an individual down as the perpetrator.
Is law enforcement and forensic science, are they catching up? Are they connecting the
Uh,
two things, or is it still very black and white in the criminal side and law enforcement side? I actually have my criminal justice degree, and I think that was where I decided not to pursue it as a future career, was because I already felt a big disconnect. Although I went into law and stayed in law for 13 years, it was like it answered my thoughts when I was having them very early on, that the law was too black and white
yes.
for me to want to continue to show up in a way where I thought I was helping people. Because what may have happened is one thing, and they're just twisting it for either side's benefit.
Mm. Yeah, it's a very zero-sum game. And like you said, with law specifically, let's just call it the criminal justice system in general, um, functions on the idea that there is some amount of conscious approach to a behavior. And they're constantly trying to apply whether or not there was a conscious approach to reacting or acting in a particular behavioral format. Um, if we go by the anticipatory brain model that we know of, well, there is no consciousness in that aspect. Everything has a sequential trigger all the way to your conception and preconceptional stages. So even if someone is reacting in an aggressive manner, you can trace it. You can trace what neuron, what hormone, what neurotransmitter, all the way up to what's going on prenatally, or what's going on in the well, epigenetics of the father or the mother, or whatever is going on over there. You can actually trace it all the way back. And to then bring that individual into law enforcement and say, okay, as part of the criminal justice system, you are responsible for ABC, when in fact, if you do follow the whole anticipatory model, you don't really get anyone who's responsible. It's kind of like saying, back in the day, if someone contracted a disease, one would say, oh, the devil has set their eyes on them and they have to be killed. They have to, some sort of events should probably occur for the whole village to sort of see. If you do contract this disease, you are evil. Satan has set his eyes upon you, and all of these things. Now we know that it's not their fault, but we do quarantine them for this, for the hope for society to function the way it does, up until the point that they are well enough to be rehabilitated into society again. What we don't see that yet in the criminal justice system. We don't see that quarantining them as beneficial impact upon society and as well as upon them. What we see is you're responsible, you're a good person or a bad person, and you are going to serve a sentence, which isn't really rehabilitating them in any sort of format. Because if society, in their eyes, has brought them up this way, then they don't really have, you know, uh, conscious effort being put in and actually having to behave in this fashion. They've just been brought up that way. That being said, I'm not trying to say that the victim's life is invalidated. No, no, no. Absolutely validated. Hence, the necessary need to quarantine these individuals in order to ensure that they get rehabilitated. And Nordic countries do that. They offer them, well, master's degrees and stuff like that so that they can actually live their lives, study, become better individuals, and then possibly, if they earned it, go back into society and get rehabilitated. But that requires having to deal with systematic inequalities within the society and focusing on those as opposed to focusing on bad behavior or good behavior, which is very superficial, which I highly doubt capitalistic environments like, well, the country that we live in is going to probably focus on these things.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely understand that. And I think, having been through trauma and spent, the last 4 years educating myself and having met other people who I've had as guests on my podcast who look at like ancestral, like you were talking about, like who we are right here today. We're a piece of our ancestral history.
Mm-hmm.
And so, learning about that information has really helped me understand a lot of things from the victim perspective, from the perpetrator perspective, from good, bad. It just helps having knowledge beyond what I may know today or what I may see in TV, or even understanding like my own background and the fact that as somebody who's been adopted and has no background information, I don't know in my family lineage, in my bloodline, what has or hasn't happened to my ancestors that is affecting me today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and well, in those regards, molecular biology has actually flourished to probably understand if you were to go and get a genealogy history being done by a geneticist, they can actually offer you uh, concrete evidence as to this is what's going on within your genes. There is also this aspect of the telomere length on your chromosome and whether or not it corresponds to certain disease predisposition that we may or may not see in the future. If you have long telomeres or short telomeres, how does that respond to trauma that you have faced? And not just you have faced, how does it respond to any sort of epigenetically marked stress or trauma responses that exist within your body, and how that impacts the telomere length, and thereafter anything related to cancerous situations to all the way to immunological aspects of your life. Does that have any responses or does it have any impacts on those things? So molecular biology does pave a path to sort of understand in these scenarios wherein history might be not enough to um, gather all the facts necessary.
Yeah. Let's talk about the body's response to trauma, because that's something that, in society, especially for sexual assault victims, Um, there's always a question about the woman's body's response. So, why does the vulva sometimes show signs of arousal during assault?
Yeah, yeah. Well, to those who have actually experienced this, firstly, the society is not really well informed. So uh, it gauges a woman or it gauges a femme-bodied individual, well, as I would say, an object of society as opposed to an individual on its own. It's how much can you be of utilitarian use for the society as opposed to how can you be and just be. That being said, there are two volumes of measures that researchers have taken, and this is the vaginal pulse amplitude and the vaginal blood volume, VPA and VPM. Um, there were several researches that were done few years back, and it suggested based on three different types of anxieties whether or not there is any increase or decrease in the vaginal pulse amplitude. That's how you measure physical sexual arousal. Um, One of them is a state anxiety. You have a trait anxiety, and what they also observed is anxiety sensitivity. Um, with state anxiety, it's like an acute emotional response. It's like characterized by increased activation of sympathetic nervous system. But it's very, very transitory, so it can be manipulated. That being said, it can actually be induced. There are anxiety induction protocols that exist within behavioral sciences fields. Um, Two studies come to mind. One was in 1977 by Hoon and another by Palace and Gorzalka in 1990, I think. And both concluded that increases in state anxiety is correlated to an increase in physiological sexual arousals. That is vaginal blood volume and vaginal pulse amplitude. Um, the another role that anxiety might be playing over here is also like blocking any conscious awareness to process the stimuli, especially if the stimuli is being coded as arousing stimuli. And it can be sort of harmful, I suppose, in scenarios wherein if you were to delve back and if you were to actually heal from situations to come into realization that you were roused, uh, may or may not have detrimental impacts on the healing aspect of the individual. So when individuals were checked upon this, they reported lower arousal rates. However, the body is still clocking arousal rates. So there's a little to no conscious awareness as to what the body is up to. And that could be the fact that maybe several areas of the mind, prefrontal cortex, and all these areas are being impaired. So you're not really applying any conscious awareness to situations. You're just taking situations as it is. Um, the other two anxieties that they checked for was trait anxiety. That is like it's a relatively stable measure, and whether or not the individual has a dispositional tendency to experience state anxiety. That's the extreme anxiety. It's less predictive of any acute, physiological sexual arousals. And it was, I think, if I'm not wrong, 1975 when Spielberg sort of found that individuals have a biased tendencies of perceiving threatening information. And if you have a tendency of perceiving an information as extremely threatening, it can cause a negative interpretation on any sort of arousal. So arousal can actually go down. And these are cases that we see with individuals who have had a history of abuse or have had a history of any uh, well, authoritative parentage and stuff like that, that may or may not result in them perceiving every single thing in front of them as threatening or life-threatening scenarios. And then finally, we also have anxiety, sensitivity, like it's just the fear of the anxiety response itself. Now, coming back to the question that you asked, why do we exhibit sexual arousal? Well, we don't, not all the time. We just do so with respect to state anxiety. And we just do so in cases of where an individual, before any trauma does occur, clock in about a moderate degree of state anxiety. If you have a moderate degree of state anxiety, before any administration of any anxiety protocols and stuff like that, you do show a higher VPA, that's vaginal pulse amplitude. Whereas those who have like high or low state anxieties before any anxiety inductions, they clock in very low VPA. We also had trait anxiety, which showed no impact on VPA. And well, it's not surprising that anxiety sensitivity also did not really show any VPA. But with anxiety sensitivity, it's actually very interesting. So so the nuance over here is very important. Uh, when we talk about trait anxiety, we don't see any physical sexual arousal, that is FSFI, that we call female sexual function index, that basically talks about extent to which woman can become aroused and stay mentally aroused. Uh, so trait anxiety, it's kind of unrelated altogether with FSFI. But it has a stronger correlation to the mental aspects of sexual arousal. While it doesn't show any physical sexual arousal, it may have mental impacts. Anxiety sensitivity over here, well, just tends to have lower FSFI. So when we look at it in totality, it is not all the time that individuals do show signs of arousal. It has like a curvilinear relationship, especially with state anxiety. If you clock in low and high state anxieties, your arousals are actually low, whereas if you clock in medium or moderate levels of state anxieties, your arousal levels after the induction of a traumatic event is higher. Whereas with the rest of them, also, it's a very nuanced aspect of looking at whether or not an individual gets aroused. One reason could be that, well, it is sort of easier on the body if any penetration does occur, if the body is already aroused. There is already a lot of painful memories that is being coded upon. The last thing the body requires is possibly uh, physical pain. That is also hard to recover from. So, in some cases, individuals do experience arousal in the moderate state anxiety levels. They experience arousals to ensure that the body doesn't respond in a way.
Thank you. That was actually very informative for understanding what all is going on in the body, that there are natural things that our body is set up to do, as opposed to, the claim that arousal equals consent. And that's why I wanted to cover this topic and the others that we're talking about, so that people understand the difference.
Yes, and to also make note over here, any consent provided in scenarios that are being clocked as threatening or life-threatening scenarios is a manufactured consent. It is something an individual may or may not say in order to appease the perpetrators so as to ensure the harm that may or may not come thereafter is going to be much lower than the harm they may experience if they said no. So again, these are things that are already being coded upon in our brains, and it's kind of hard to segregate it and say, "Oh, this is exactly when it developed." But once individuals start investigating what's really happening and where it comes from, you can see patterns as to why the brain responds in a way like this to ensure that in the future, well, at least you stay alive. You stay alive and you're not clocking in too many painful memories that, yes, PTSD reactions do occur, but there are degrees to it. So the brain will constantly try and ensure that you are not, in this case, ridden by complete guilt and complete shame. So it tries and ensures that you recover at so.
Yeah, that was helpful also. Um, I guess the consent that you were talking about is the fawning reaction.
It can occur in either case, bait and fawning, beat and freeze. Individuals may just mumble and say, okay, whatever, or something like that. But uh, it's not an informed consent. Informed consent takes place wherein there's no coercion occurring. Where there is coercion, where there is a life-threatening scenario around you, any consent that falls in that aspect is, well, it's not an informed, rational consent.
Okay. Why are we often trapped in cycles of abuse or trauma reenactment? Is this a matter of psychology or neurology or both?
Um, well, I don't possibly like to put barriers or banners on top of something. When we talk about cycles, we talk about patterns. The brain loves patterns. The
Mhm.
more predictive an environment is, the brain actually thrives in it because it's able to clock in certain aspects of your environment. And, well, the responses, reactionary part of your behavioral response is much quicker and much faster because you're able to predict what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. So after a while, it gets, well, coded as safe, unfortunately, because these are these are patterns that are so repetitive that the brain has gotten so used to them that after a while it just becomes, well, this equals normal. And anything that may or may not break the pattern can actually feel uh, very threatening for an individual. If you ask an individual to break a cycle of abuse and, well, a partner who has been abusing them for the past 25 plus years or something like that, you will often see them go into that, well, that shock of, oh, I don't know how to live my life. This is how I've lived my life all this has been how I've lived my life every day. But I don't know if I can survive without this person. And if I do leave this person, what's the guarantee that another person, and what's the guarantee that I'm actually going to survive? This individual at least knows who I am. So these are the responses that we often get. And this is in case of, well, because we get so used to these patterns and it becomes so normalized in our brain that anything else seems like very, very threatening. The analogy I like to use here is trapped in a balloon. So we sort of construct everything that we know of in our environment is, well, our perception of what's actually happening. So if you put in another individual in the same scenario, same environment, they are still going to perceive in a different manner. It's just how our brains are constructed in different ways. So whatever we look at in our environment is just a balloon. It's our perception of what actually is outside. When we have that balloon, you take anything that says, oh, you want to get out of the balloon, it's kind of like taking a pin and poking the balloon and saying, okay, come out. And for many individuals, that seems like the end of the world. Because to be honest, that was the world, because that's the only perceived world that they can see. So we keep repeating patterns, we keep repeating behaviors. Why? Because, well, it's a charted territory, it's familiar, it's predictable, it's coded as safe.
I can understand that. I think I grew up in that environment. And by the time I was in my late teens, it had become so familiar, such a pattern, so normal, um, that it became like, okay, well, if the worst thing that's going to happen to me is something I'm already used to, the abuse that I was already used to receiving, then I'm just going to go out and do these things because I know that the worst I'm going to get is beat when I get home. And it became this, very normal, very familiar thing that I had experienced for so long that after a certain time, I was just like, well, I know what's going to happen. I know what to expect. So I might as well just find a way to live my life the best that I can within the
Yeah.
confines of that normalcy.
Yeah. And I mean, again, your brain's only function is to ensure that you survive. That's literally its only role. And it will probably come up with several ways in order to actually achieve that role. And well, we have you here today with us. So it did work.
It did work. And
Mhm.
I guess at the same time, too, I can understand being trapped and being afraid to leave a situation that has become so normal and so safe, and thinking that you can't function outside of that situation,
Mhm.
or repeating the same things with another partner or another family member or another situation. When I did eventually leave the house, get out from under my mother's abuse, I thought I was safe from it. I was safe to a degree, but again, it was something I couldn't control. Her reaction to me leaving,
Mm.
which ended up being worse than anything I could have ever imagined. But at the same time, I strongly suggest if you can leave, leave. Um, you know, what happened to me after I left, I hope is not the normal. Um,
Depends on where the individual is, what's going on in their lives, and sometimes leaving is the hardest thing to do. And in such scenarios, if anyone is in that scenario, I would say, well, write everything down, write what is going on, write what are the aspects in which you can actually change what is going on. And then you categorize it based on what option has the least to the most disadvantageous result in case it doesn't work out. So you're constantly going to guess, constantly going to overthink what's going on any which way. So might as well clock it down, might as well write everything down to analyze what's actually possible. And instead of just, well, leaving, it takes a lot of courage to do that. And if you're not there in that zone yet, go with, well, in a single week, is there one thing that you can change? And then maybe in the next week, is there two things that you can change? Is there three things that you can change? And eventually you gather enough courage to sort of break the cycle. Uh, what I do see a lot of individuals is that they do experience, well, we call them the butterflies in the stomach sort of reaction, when they're able to find different partners in their lives who have pretty much similar tendencies. So it kind of feels like you're dating the same person, or you're in a relationship with the same person again and again and again, because you constantly choose the same characteristics again and again and again. And that's where your cycle comes in. It becomes very difficult even after leaving that, whether or not to be in that relationship with so and so person. Uh, there are ways to actually check. And yes, it's important to look at whether or not attraction is possible. But in these cases, when familiarity equals something that was by default very traumatic in nature, attraction is to someone who displays the same traumatic nature of a relationship. So we will feel butterflies in the stomach for the same individual again and again and again, who possibly, well, resembles the ex or resembles someone from the past. Uh, so you experience butterflies in the stomach in those scenarios, and you go heart in, you go sex in, and well, 2 years down the line, you're still trapped in that cycle. What I would suggest in those scenarios is to look for partners whom you're not able to gauge at all, whom you're not able to categorize and say, oh, pattern 1, 2, 3 equals this, or I can actually see where this thing is going. I can actually read this individual. This is where it's headed. Uh, because in these unfamiliar scenarios is where you may or may not find an individual who is not reinforcing the same trauma that you have experienced, and you can actually break the cycle. And yes, you may not feel butterflies in the stomach at all, because you're constantly trying to gauge what's going on. Who is this person? I'm not able to place them. I'm not able to. I've never met a person like this in my life before. They are completely contradictory to the individuals that I have been with until now. And that's exactly what we want. Because the more we challenge the brain to look for things that are in an unfamiliar, uncharted territory, the easier it is to break any pattern or any cycle.
Thank you for going into that as well, because that is possible. It was for me. It took me years of being outside of any relationship other than with myself, and building a relationship with myself, for me to then be aware of the patterns I was used to repeating and repeating and repeating, um, before going into another relationship, to be able to really clearly see if those patterns were there or not there. And I have been very blessed to be in a relationship that has none of those patterns that I had been in for so long. So they are out there. They're those types of relationships that are safe, that are loving, that are nurturing. They exist. Um, and so,
Yeah.
thank you for
Yeah.
for
Yeah. And the
talking about
aspect is
that.
also to look into time. The aspect is also to look into time.
Mhm.
And they say time is a healer. Yes, it is, because there are cases, and don't quote me on this because I don't remember who did this or where it's coming from, but I do remember vaguely that there were cases about any synapses being formed to last probably about 7 years or so. And thereafter, you sort of move on from any environment, be it synapses that are formed in extreme love cases or extreme trauma cases and stuff like that. It takes about 7 years for you to recover. If you are going to reinforce those synapses again and again and again, then they continue to stay that way. But if you're healing from a traumatic event and you don't want any memory or any association with that individual, then it approximately takes around 7 years or so for any neuroplasticity to occur.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I will look to learn more information about that research. I think that's fascinating information to have. What are your thoughts on systemic healing and the role of gendered trauma in the healing equation?
Hmm. Um, well, we do associate men with a lot of uh, aggression and aggressive behaviors that systematically we sort of raise them in an environment that aggressive behaviors A is normal, B is well equal to showing how manly you are, and it's tied to your masculinity, it's tied to your ego. But when we talk about systemic healing, when we talk about specifically therapy, it is different in different individuals. Um, Therapy was predominantly designed for women, and strangely speaking, it was designed to ensure women whose characters are loose or who are acting out can actually be rehabilitated to a patriarchal society. And it was designed as a coercive mechanism to ensure that they stay put and they adhere to the social norms as opposed to actually acting out. This was the dark side of therapy, but it has evolved. It has evolved to feature itself in the most positive sense in our lives. But with women, we also see a society that has made space for healing. We do see healing circles and healing spaces wherein we acknowledge what's going on, we understand what's going on, and we, as collectively, as a unit, uh, have someone to rely on in situations where our healing goes south. And we have protective systems in place to ensure that everything goes according to what it is. Uh, with men in general, we don't have communities in place. So, no matter how well structured talk therapy is, unless and until there is a community or a social environment that prioritizes and thrives upon talk therapy being well brilliant approach to actually healing any systemic prejudices an individual has faced and any uh, reactionary modes that an individual has at that point and thereafter after facing such like inequalities. uh, it doesn't feature that way in men, so it can actually be very isolating for a man to venture into talk therapy because the society that they have been brought up with uh, doesn't really prioritize and doesn't really leave prioritize. It doesn't really acknowledge therapy at all. So the only way I possibly see therapy working is wherein there are communal spaces, community and society around the aspect of areas where men embody such communities to ensure that whatever therapy that they're going through is going to be beneficial. To also note here is that many of them don't respond to talk therapy. It seems like a general consensus that, oh, everybody in the world responds to talk therapy, but most of our conversations are very non-verbal in nature, and we are responding to only verbal basis of therapeutic interventions. And when an individual is upset, when an individual is emotional, when an individual is reacting to the scenarios around them, um, you don't really see them verbalizing much. The emotions are too powerful. The body is convulsing. It is going into, or rather, experiencing the trauma, re experiencing the trauma again. So, quite at times, talk therapy can actually pretty much fail, even in the conventional sense. Uh, this is where complementary therapeutic interventions like music, art, dance, can actually come into being. We have therapeutic interventions around cooking, around gardening, around nature walks, and a lot of things that don't really scream talk therapy, but allows the body to possibly heal itself and choose its own modality to heal, as opposed to forcing it down a cognitive terrain. And it's hard for many to actually recognize this is what's going on in our body. This is how I verbalize what's going on in my body. And this is how I seek therapeutic interventions with respect to these aspects that's occurring within my body. So, in many cases, one should probably look at what does an individual gravitate towards when they are lonely, when they are sad, when they are angry? What kind of interventions do you anyway look at? Do you go to the gym? Do you run a lot when you're extremely angry? Do you go outside and chop wood? Do you go on long hiking terrains? What is something that you're actually doing as a hobby? These are areas that can be prioritized as therapeutic interventions as opposed to talk therapy.
Yeah. I I'm happy to see that there is change happening where there are more environments where men can come together in community. Um, and I think it's because of the circles of people that I surround myself with that more and more men are coming into that circle who have reached a point where they're questioning what their body is experiencing, and they're wanting answers, and they're wanting to look into those interventions that are maybe outside of talk therapy, because it has been so ingrained in them not to share, not to be vulnerable, not to talk about anything. But I think there is a shift happening finally. I'm hearing more about it in the news. I'm hearing more about it in the few men that I've been able to bring onto the podcast. And I'm always looking for more men who are willing to come on the podcast and talk about these things, and talk about, maybe interventions that they have found. I know that a lot of the men that I've talked to are either finding the community side where they're going on men's retreats so that they're in an environment where they can talk in what they feel is a safe space. And I'm also learning from a lot of men who are doing a lot of somatic therapy. But even then, they're met up against so many walls that have been placed on them and in their body, that when it's time to verbalize those things, that's where they really struggle. And it takes a lot to break those walls down, and face them or walk through them. Um, so, I'm happy that more and more men are coming forward. I'm happy that more and more men are talking about their mental health challenges. I'm happy that more and more men are creating those safe spaces within their professions as well. Like I've seen a lot of light coming into first responder professions. And I think it's great that it's shifting and it's changing, and anything that we all can do collectively to welcome men into a safe space, to show them that they can have those conversations, that they can lean into those experiences, and that there are people out there to help them through those experiences. And it may not be talk therapy. Like you said, it may be art therapy. It may be, being out in nature. But there are more things available now than I think ever have been.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've known several places wherein men have gone into, well, boxing and martial arts to sort of address their traumas. And I find it amazing that they have actually found an outlet and they have figured a way to channel that rage, to figure out a way to actually understand what's going on in the body, to say, this is how I'm going to respond with that rage. As opposed to, well, it's very easy for society to say, oh, this is it, this is normal behavior, and react this way. And it's extremely hard because individuals cannot be categorized as normal or abnormal. And it's it's hard for, well, many individuals to kind of feature whatever society wants us to feature.
Yeah. Where can people find you? Where can people learn more about your research, learn more about the different things you have put together, the different initiatives? Where can people find you? I want to make sure to include all of that information in the show notes.
Absolutely. Well, my go-to response is my website. Pillow Talk with Nixie is the hub for anything for, well, research, educational initiatives, all the way to, well, a free library as well. If you are looking for neurosex coaching, I would suggest going through Eros Coaching. That's Martha's initiative, and I'm listed down there. If individuals are looking who are from BDSM and alt sex spaces, NCSF is where you can find me. In for individuals from LGBTQ backgrounds, Liberatory Wellness Initiative, that is Liberatory Wellness Network, and GLMA is where you can find me. And finally, I have a space where I offer therapy for even sex workers who have gone through trauma. And you can reach out to me through Equitable Care Certification. Uh, and Kinksters who want anything to do with neurosex alternatives and understanding your own body and your mind, you can find me through Forbidden Tickets.
Great, thank you. I will add some of those that I didn't already have on the list for the show notes. I definitely wanted to remember to add the Eros coaching. I want to mention that, and I'll have to look at the date, when I'm going to have you on my Kink Your Way podcast so that we can talk to those kinksters for more information to understand about their body. Looking through my calendar, I should have had this written down. The end of the month, August 28th. So if you want to know more from Nishita, please make sure you subscribe to my Kink Your Way podcast because she's going to come back and grace us with more information, more research, more understanding. She has reminded us that healing isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about understanding what's been wired for survival in our brain, in our body. If you are a survivor or someone who supports them, I hope today's conversation has offered clarity, validation, and empowerment. You can learn more about her work and her revolutionary initiatives. I'll make sure to include as much as I can as far as contact information in the show notes. If this episode moved you, please share it. You never know whose shame it might help unravel. Until next time, remember your body is wise, your brain is brilliant, and you are never alone in your healing. I want to thank you so much for sharing your time with me today and sharing your time and education and information and knowledge and research with our listeners. I appreciate you so much, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you so much for having me, Leann. And yes, until next time.
We will talk soon.